So, when war broke out with Iran in 2026, it wasn't just some regional dust-up. Nope, this was a full-blown global breakdown. In this explainer, we're going to dissect how a single strike spiraled into three distinct but totally interconnected crises: a massive air campaign, a naval blockade that literally crippled the world economy, and a wave of retaliation that set the entire Middle East on fire.
But before we get into the strategy and the politics, you have to wrap your head around this number: 3.2 million. That's how many Iranians were forced from their homes in just the first 2 weeks of the war. It's a staggering figure that reminds us that behind all the strategic maneuvering, there's always an immense human cost.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll start with the initial spark, Operation Epic Fury, then move to the devastating air campaign and the critical war at sea. After that, we'll look at Iran's massive retaliation and see how the whole thing just snowballed into a global crisis. So, what was that spark? How did decades of simmering tension finally just explode? Well, it all kicked off with a single, massive military operation that had the codename Epic Fury. Everything changed on February 28th. The US and Israel launched joint strikes, but this wasn't just about hitting military targets. In the early morning hours, they carried out what's known as a decapitation strike, killing Iran's supreme leader. The thinking was this would throw the country into chaos. But the response was swift and it was furious. Within hours, Iran's retaliation began, and the war was on. And that's Operation Epic Fury in a nutshell. The official goals were crystal clear: dismantle Iran's military and force a change in regime. And that brings us right to the first major front of this war: the skies over Iran. All right, let's talk about that first front, the air campaign. The objective, and this is a quote from a US official, was to blast Iran into oblivion. And when you look at the list of targets, you realize just how comprehensive this strategy was. The goal wasn't just to hit military sites, but to paralyze the entire Iranian state. We're talking everything from their nuclear facilities and leadership compounds to the headquarters of the powerful Revolutionary Guard Corps and even vital economic hubs like the Karg Island oil terminal. And to give you a sense of the sheer intensity of this thing, U.S. Central Command reported hitting over 5,000 targets in just the first 10 days. This wasn't a series of surgical strikes, folks. This was a relentless, nationwide aerial assault. And if you want to know what the real strategy was, look no further than this quote from the U.S. Defense Secretary. He publicly denied it was a regime change war, but then he immediately added, the regime sure did change. It pretty much confirms the decapitation strike wasn't some unintended consequence. It was the entire point. Okay, so that's the war from the air. Now let's shift to the second front, the one that took this regional war and turned it into a global economic emergency. This is the war at sea, all fought over the world's most critical energy choke point. So how does Iran hit back against that massive air campaign? Well, they play their most powerful card. Their forces move to effectively shut down the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway where a huge percentage of the world's oil supply flows. And this slide right here shows you the immediate, staggering impact. On the left, that's normal traffic, right? About a fifth of all global oil passing through. On the right, after Iran's blockade, whoa, traffic just plummets by 90%. Just like that, the world's most important energy artery was clamped shut. And let's be clear, this wasn't just another disruption. The International Energy Agency, the world's energy watchdog, they called it the single largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. The economic shockwaves were felt instantly, everywhere. But here's the thing, Iran wasn't just fighting a defensive war at sea. At the exact same time they were choking off the world's oil, they unleashed the third front of the war, a massive retaliatory campaign on a scale nobody had seen before. They called it Operation True Promise 4. This chart gives you a data-driven look at the scale of that response. I mean, look at this. On the very first day, Iran launched 438 ballistic missiles. And check out the drone launches, peaking at nearly 500 in a single day. This was no token response. This was a sustained, high-volume assault. Just look at this list of countries they targeted. You can see the strategy here was to widen the conflict as much as possible. It wasn't just about hitting Israel. Iran struck U.S. allies and partners right across the board, from the Gulf states all the way to Azerbaijan and even the NATO member Turkey, deliberately turning this whole thing into a regional inferno. And they weren't just lobbing missiles randomly. They specifically targeted high-value economic infrastructure, The goal was to inflict maximum pain on its regional rivals. We're talking fires at the massive Aramco refinery in Saudi Arabia, attacks on airports in Dubai and Kuwait, and a crippling strike on Qatar's liquefied natural gas, or LNG facilities, that took a huge chunk of their export capacity right offline. This headline really captures the human side of all those strategic strikes. For millions of people, both expatriates and citizens, the Gulf's reputation as this stable, secure hub was just shattered overnight. The very idea of a safe haven in the region vanished in a hail of missiles and drones. Okay, so let's recap. You've got a massive air war over Iran, you've got a naval blockade of the world's most important choke point, and you've got these widespread regional attacks. Now let's see how these three fronts smash together to create a profound global crisis.
The global fallout was really this cascade of one crisis triggering another. It all starts with that energy shock from the blockade, right? Well, that shatters global supply chains. That, in turn, fuels insane inflation, sends markets into a nosedive, and brings on the threat of a worldwide recession. And all of this is happening while the humanitarian disaster on the ground is just getting worse.
And here's a really crucial point. This crisis did not stay neatly contained in the Middle East. With Iranian missiles actually landing in Turkey and threatening Cyprus, the conflict suddenly expanded to touch the borders of NATO itself. Now it's a direct threat to European and global security. As The Economist put it at the time, the economic damage was both severe and unevenly distributed. Countries in Europe and Asia that depend heavily on energy imports got hit particularly hard. But really, no corner of the global economy was left untouched by the shockwaves from the Persian Gulf. So after all is said and done, we're left with this really critical question. The Iranian regime was decapitated, sure, but the global economy was shattered, and new, much deeper fault lines were carved right across the Middle East. It just forces you to ask, in a modern interconnected war like this, what does victory even look like?